good morning to people in the US and good afternoon to the rest of the world, pretty much. My name is Marina Bizignana. I will be moderating this conference today. As you know, the conference is dedicated to innovative investments in Ukraine. It's one of the series of conferences that has been organized by Ukraine Invest, the promotion office of the government of Ukraine. And we would like to kick off this by just setting the scene of what we will be talking about today, and then I will be introducing the speakers in turn, and we will have a Q&A session in the end. So if possible, please send your questions through and we will make sure that we'll address them. As you know, the war in Ukraine represents the largest military conflict since the Second World War in the European continent. And as a result of that, there has been a significant decline in the economic activity in Ukraine. And that has been not just in the investment activity, obviously in the deals, in all sectors, including real estate, including infrastructure and the likes. Having said that, Ukraine is now very much on the map for impact investing globally, probably more than ever before. And I can say that in my practice as a fund formation lawyer, I have never seen so much investment activity and so much interest in investment activity in Ukraine than ever before. So I think that creates an amazing opportunity for all of us. But what we need to think about, and what the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian businesses work very hard on, is to make sure that the international investment community has the right mechanisms to enter Ukraine and invest in the private sector there. And that will be done by, most likely by a combination of various financing instruments, for example, combining equity and debt finance. That will be done by a combination of investors, combining capital from the state, donor capital, private investor capital. That will be done with, using some very unique elements and unique features, such as military and war risk insurance. And so the purpose of today's event is to discuss the various mechanisms that foreign investors, direct investors, or fund managers who are looking to raise funds for Ukraine, they can utilize in order to make investments in Ukraine, and particularly in private sector. So I would like to kick off with our first session, which is welcome remarks. And I would like to give the floor to Yulia Sviridenko, who is first Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine and the Minister of Economy of Ukraine. So Yulia, please, if you could give your welcome remarks.
Ukraine's recovery will be one of the most ambitious projects of the 21st century, requiring efforts and vast resources. Ukraine's recovery market is estimated at $500 to $900 billion US. Most of this financed is going to be from private sector, of course. Why will Ukraine become the next investment magnet for the world? Because business activity in Ukraine means long-term and stable benefits. Access to the EU and G7 markets, Ukraine is a gateway to both established economies and emerging markets. Optimal location for production and headquarters. With Ukraine's strategy location, skilled workforce, and resources, investors can establish a strong presence and become key players in both domestic and international markets. Freedom to foster economic development and digitalization. Ukraine protects economic competition, fostering a fair market for business to thrive, while also implementing deregulation measures that promote flexibility, efficiency, and innovation. To achieve ambitious economic growth plans, we need people who are willing to put it into reality. We will create conditions for Ukrainians to return and invite all who have helped us to live and develop in our country. There are three key prerequisites are essential for the swift repatriation of individuals and the economic prosperity of Ukraine. First, it's ensuring security. Second, upholding freedom and justice. And third, fostering a drive and dynamic economy. Security is a strong state where the government guarantees safety for all citizens, economic freedom and justice for all, drive and dynamic development of the economy. Ukraine's economy is free, competitive and attractive for investment, developing thanks to innovation and reliable cooperation with international partners. Yet, we recognize that we cannot achieve this alone. Therefore, we actively seek strategic partnership that can serve as catalyst for investment. This is why it's crucial for us to become a strong partner capable of not only pursuing our own goals, but also meeting the needs of our partners.
Thank you. So that was the first video, as you saw, and now we're moving on to live speakers. And Oleg Nemchinov, Minister of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, please, if you could give your welcome remark.
Доброго дня. Я хочу приєднатися до тих слів, які у своєму відеозверненні сказала пані Североденко. І дійсно стоїмо на порозі важливих подій, і я маю надію, що після завершення військового стану будемо потребувати не тільки інвестицій, але, власне, репатріації назад всіх громадян України, які через збройну агресію Російської Федерації змушені були залишити наші межі. Уряд України реалізує цілу низку ініціатив, спрямованих на забезпечення подальшого зростання України та підвищення її інвестиційного привабливості. Попри ризики та перестороги, які, можливо, мають потенційні інвестори, Україна існує чимало інвестиційно привабливих секторів. Це і будівельні матеріали, логістика, агропереробник, гірничо-видобувний комплекс, зелені технології та електротранспорт. Звичайно, підрив дамби Каховської гідроелектростанції російськими окупантами, він змушує нас по-новому дивитися на цілі сектори економіки, зокрема сільського господарства. Але я переконаний, що і цей виклик Україна подолає. Уряд продовжує фінансувати різноманітні фінансові інструменти, кредитні ініціативи для надання фінансової підтримки малого бізнесу і навіть середнього бізнесу, помітні зрушення в сфері електронного врядування та електронних послуг, де Україна є беззаперечним лідером в Європі і у світі, зокрема щодо системи взаємодії держава і я, Дія, яке зараз поширюється як онлайн-платформа для декількох європейських, африканських та південноамериканських держав. Аби конкурувати глобально, Україна запровадила систему державної підтримки значних інвестиційних проєктів. Такими проєктами, власне, опікується Офіс з підтримки інвестицій «Українінвест». Найголовніше – це закон створив новий для України підхід до державної підтримки інвестицій через запровадження системи податкових та митних пільг, земельних та інфраструктурних стимулів, які становлять до 30% планового обсягу значних інвестицій. Це можливі сфери застосування, всі можливі сфери застосування закону демонструють його фокусування на широкому спектрі ринкових інвестицій. Я вже згадував про переробну промисловість та інші сегменти ринку, зокрема поводження з відходами, транспорт, логістику, зокрема, поштову і кур'єрську діяльність. Я думаю, що після завершення активної фази бойових дій повернеться інвестиційна привабливість до туризму та культурно-рекреаційної. Вже цієї весни Верховна Рада України, український парламент підтримала у першому читанні законопроект, яким передбачається суттєві покращення до нього, і ми очікуємо на розгляд цього законопроекту у другому читанні. Ми робимо все можливе, щоб заохотити тих, хто вже успішно працює в Україні, бути готовими інвестувати більше. Ми готові докласти максимум зусиль, щоб зробити Україну привабливою та гостинною для майбутніх інвесторів. Слава Україні!
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oleg. And now we are moving on to Yakov Siliers, UNDP resident representative to Ukraine. We will hear more today from UNDP. There's a lot of activity that's going on and a lot of cooperation between the Ukrainian government and UNDP. So Yakov, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and I apologize in advance. I'm talking to you from a moving car on my way back from Lviv to Kiev, but it's a great honor for us to be here, and I apologize if the connection gets a little bit bad. And please stop me, facilitator, if you can't hear me clearly. But just to say that
I think the connection has just gone a little bit bad, but perhaps we can just move on and maybe come back to Jaakko a little bit later. So why don't we just move on to part 2 and then perhaps catch up. So in part 2, and as I said in the beginning, the purpose of this event is to look at the various mechanisms that there are available to us given what we have, and we have to deal with what we have, and the situation in Ukraine obviously is not the simplest when it comes to foreign investment, and in particular investment into private sector. So we would like to take a look and discuss today what can be done and what mechanisms we could explore. I'm sorry, Jaakko, are you back?
Yes, I don't know if you can hear me, colleagues. Is it better now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, I apologize again. But just to say, at the United Nations Development Programme, we're really committed to help and work on an inclusive digital and sustainable recovery efforts. We are looking at various ways to support the government, and also this innovative financing and de-risking mechanisms being talked about today is really an innovative way of also looking at bringing in recovery and larger financing into the efforts to help and support the people of Ukraine. We know that the recovery efforts will be at least $411 billion worth. That came from the World Bank, UN, EU-led rapid damage needs assessment, and we know with the Kakhovka Dam situation that's just going to get worse. So how to also collaborate with various stakeholders will be absolutely crucial as we move forward. We believe in UNDP that we can play a really catalytic role in driving innovation and sustainable finance, and creating also a sustainable and robust framework for products and facilitating collaborations. As was mentioned, you'll hear a little bit more about that later today. We are really committed to support and partner with our government counterparts and leading the recovery efforts, and we look forward to work with Ukraine Invest, the Ministry of Recovery and the Minister of Economy, and many other partners from the private and public sectors in moving this forward. Thank you for this great honor to join you. And again, I apologize for the difficulty with the communications, but I appreciate this and look forward to the results of this event.
Thank you, Jaakko. That was brilliant, and the sound is as clear as it can be. So, and that's very important to flag that there's been actually a lot of support from the various organizations and large investors throughout the world, the United Nations, EBRD, and the likes. There's a lot in the press. But we're moving on to our part 2, and I would like to give the floor to Natalie Yareska, whom many of you probably have met through these events in the past. So Natalie is the former Minister of Finance of Ukraine, and currently she is with EY. As you know, EY is one of the world's largest consultants in the world. Natalie, please, if you could begin the next part.
I'm not sure if Natalie is online now.
Okay, so Sergey, why don't we move?
Maybe,
So Sergey Tsivkach, you probably know him very well. So he is an executive director of Ukraine Invest, extremely active in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. So please, Sergey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marina. We think that this is a very important event because Ukraine needs a lot of finance. Ukraine needs a lot of investments, and these times are unprecedented. And we need to have innovative investment mechanisms in order to support Ukraine right away. We cannot wait till the end of full-scale invasion, till our victory. We need to support businesses right away. And today we talk about business in general and with some specific focus on SMEs. So I would like to share my presentation with some analytics, some ideas, and some information about what we do and how this could benefit developments and investments into SME sector specifically. To start with, I would like to talk a bit about macroeconomic situation in Ukraine. So we see that exchange rate is quite stable since August 2022. So it's almost a year when Ukraine, with support of international partners, remains active in this area. And we try to stabilize the economy, and you can see results on your screen. So the rate of US dollar is quite flat. for almost a year now. Euro rate is also within the boundaries of acceptable changes. And we can see that the level of international reserves is increasing all the time. So now it's about 36 billion US dollars. That is the biggest figure for the last couple of years. And that gives us insurance that the exchange rate will remain more stable, and activities of companies that are focused not on export markets, but on local markets as well, they will be more predictable. GDP growth, you know that in 2022, we had a sharp decline, about 30% decline in GDP. In first quarter of 2023, again, decline 10.5%. But according to forecast of the National Bank and the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine, we will have growth of 15.9% in second quarter, 3.9% in third, and 3.7% in the fourth quarter of this year. Support that I mentioned, since February 2022, Ukraine has received unprecedented external financial support, totaling 51.9 billion US dollars. This financial aid for Ukraine has come from 22 countries, and also institutions like World Bank, European Investment Bank, International Monetary Fund, as well as European Union. So the biggest supporters were the United States of America, $17.9 billion, and European Union, $16 billion. They're the biggest contributors. This year, we expect to receive at least 42 billion US dollars in external support to maintain economy and to keep macroeconomic figures in appropriate shape, let's say that. So what was happening pre-war? Let's look at M&A transactions and market activities. So in 2020, we have seen 1,000 M&A transactions. That was a pandemic year. After pandemic year, Ukraine was increasing M&A activities. So business was investing, business was buying assets. There was a big number of M&A transactions, total amount 2.7 billion US dollars. M&A transactions in manufacturing specifically, $340 million in deals in metallurgy, $234 million in agriculture, $142 million in petrochemical industry, and $58 million in food industry. This is only in manufacturing, as I said. Now, what we have to do to rebuild our industry? According to the World Bank latest assessment, we will need at least $411 billion to rebuild Ukraine. Out of that figure, at least $14 billion will be needed in the next 10 years, only to reconstruct the industrial facilities. So we're talking only about direct damage. Also, about $4 billion will be needed to restore service delivery of businesses in Ukraine. And there are indirect damages that will have to be covered. Those figures are way more significant, and they will have to be assessed in due course. SMEs in 2021. This is our core focus today, SMEs. So let's see how many people are employed in this sector. When we talk about large enterprises, we have 1.6 million employed in that sector. When we talk about medium and small enterprises, more than 4.6 million people are employed in this sector. So you can see how significant the need is to provide investments right now to support families, to support people, to support economy, because SMEs in Ukraine is the backbone of the economy, as in all other countries. More than 99% of all registered enterprises are SMEs in Ukraine. So we have, when we talk about figures and numbers of enterprises, in Ukraine pre-war, we had 610 large enterprises. At the same time, 17,500 medium enterprises and more than 350,000 of small enterprises. Large enterprises turnover in 2021 was $200 billion. Combined turnover of small and medium enterprises was about 330 billion US dollars. So it's a big part of Ukrainian economy. SMEs needs in financing. This is the latest assessment as of April 2023, conducted by the Advanter Group. They have talked to more than 1,000 respondents from SME sectors, and they were asking companies how much finance they need in order to maintain their operations and to think maybe also about development. So weighted average need in financing per company is over $900,000. About 6% of the SME sector will need between 4% will need between $3 to $10 million in financing, and 2% will need more than $10 million in financing. The rest of the companies will need less, but as I said, the average is about 900,000 per company. The amount is huge. The lack of finance is huge. That's why innovative investments are very important, as I said, already being introduced and thought of right now at this moment. So what kind of finance and investments usually used by SMEs in order to conduct their operations? Usually these are grants and subsidies from Ukraine and from foreign countries, sometimes from European Union specifically, commercial bank loans, private equity investments, reinvestments, IFIs financing, and venture capital. Capital investments by Ukrainian business in 2021, also pre-war year. And we can see that the structure of capital investment in manufacturing, it's quite similar if we compare large and medium enterprises. Large enterprises invested 62% in machines and equipment and 32% in construction of buildings and facilities. Medium-sized businesses invested 65% in machines and equipment and 31% in construction of buildings. Small enterprises invest more in facility itself and less in equipment. So that gives you kind of a flavor what kind of investment activities are needed and what will be needed. Because when we talk about blended finance, when we talk about innovative investments, we can also talk about leasing companies that can bring investments in the form of equipment. So it's not only financial investment that is needed. We need end product in the form of equipment or facilities that can be brought and built for the industry, and that would be a good substitution to financial investments. Reinvestment in manufacturing is one of the biggest sources of receiving capital by the companies. In 2019, reinvestments in manufacturing totaled to $4.4 billion US dollars. In 2020, 2.9, almost $3 billion. And then there was increase again in 2021 to $4.1 billion. Turnover of manufacturing in Ukraine was also significant. Food products, more than 1.1 billion. Basic materials. It's not the turnover, it's the reinvestment. So 1.1 in food products billion dollars, basic metals almost $1 billion, and then wood and paper $436 million, and rubber and plastics and other sectors also outlined in the presentation that will be shared with you. FDIs, inflows in manufacturing specifically. We have seen actually in 2020 probably the biggest equity inflow in new capital in manufacturing in Ukraine. It was $251 million. And in 2021, it was $167 million. That shows us that a lot of capital comes from reinvestment. And at the same time, not much of new capital is entering Ukraine. So that should be and is the priority for Ukrainian government, bringing of new capital, new investments to Ukraine in order to match and even do more than reinvestments. That will show that private capital feel safer in Ukraine, that there are financial instruments that allow proper investments in Ukraine. When we look at types of economic activity, so 57.4 million dollars were in food products, 35 in wood and paper, and chemicals, 19.8. So these are the three top sectors for new capital investment. Loans from Ukrainian commercial banks. In 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2023, we have seen that there was actually decline, apart from 2021, because in 2021, during pandemic year, Ukraine was providing program 579, and 2020 as well, that allowed unlocking of bank capital to companies in Ukraine. At the moment, the total loans to manufacturing industry, only manufacturing industry, is $3 billion. Almost half of it goes to production of food products in Ukraine, then $367 million to metallurgy, rubber and plastic, again, $336 million. We as Ukraine Invest initiated a program, and we are very thankful to UNDP. We are very thankful to all our governmental partners, the Ministry of Economy, to the Prime Minister of Ukraine, to all that support this activity. So we have signed a memorandum with UNDP to conduct a joint research that will suggest instruments for innovative investments that are needed for economic transformation of Ukraine. And this study will focus specifically on SME sector as stage one. So we would like to present to you the content of this study, what this study will be focused on. So first of all, there will be a macroeconomic overview of Ukraine, SMEs landscape in industrial sectors, role of SMEs in the rebuilding of Ukraine, and economic transformation. Then there will be also an overview of the international funding that may be applied for projects in Ukraine, namely for growth capital for SMEs distributed through impact investment vehicles. There are a big number of international players that can become donors for such activity. We are not only talking about kind of usual suspects like development finance institutions or European banks. We are talking about big corporations. We are talking about big family offices, investment funds that have policies to distribute some amount of their investment portfolio for impact investments. And we are hopeful that with the support of the UNDP and coordination within government of Ukraine, we will be able to reach out to that wide audience and bring capital that has not been mobilized for Ukraine yet. And we're talking about billions of US dollars. Then can be matched or over even matched by private capital, because usually $2 or $3 of donor capital can be matched with $7 or $8 of private capital. International overview of impact investment practices will be included. Overview of the recent international efforts to provide war and political risk cover for projects in Ukraine. Ministry of Economy of Ukraine doing a great job here by communicating with key players throughout the world, like MIGA, like DFC, like G7 ECAs, in order to unlock this investment insurance potential, because that will also bring more investments to Ukraine. Blended finance mechanisms that can be used for revitalization of Ukrainian SMEs in manufacturing sector, international experience and best practices. This is the point that I mentioned already. So we need to blend state money, donor money, and private capital. By doing so, we will bring way more investments in Ukraine. And we are talking about, as I said, billions only for SMEs sector. Then we will also assess readiness of Ukrainian SMEs for cooperation with private equity funds and DFIs, and we will do illustrative pipeline of projects. It's not enough to bring investment mechanism to Ukraine. We need to make sure that Ukrainian SMEs are ready to cooperate at best international standard. We need to have transparent business administration. We need to have audit accounts of companies. If we're not talking about big fours, maybe some shorter versions or other companies can be used for that, but we need to make sure that SMEs in Ukraine operate at international level in a transparent way, and that they're ready to produce proper business plans, feasibility studies, in order to explain how investment will be administrated and what kind of outcomes can be expected by the investors. Government, UNDP, and other international organizations' role in the creation and facilitation of impact investment in Ukraine is important, so we will be providing suggestions. Also, this activity should be coordinated between Ukraine, G7, in order to facilitate impact investment for SMEs. And SMEs, not only for SMEs that operate in Ukraine, but also for SMEs from throughout the world that are interested to enter Ukraine. And by doing so, we will unlock that new capital investment that I mentioned in my previous slide, because we will switch from reinvestment to bring in new capital to Ukraine. Also, we will do mapping of key stakeholders that may contribute to the development of impact investments, because we need to bring them together, we need to suggest mechanism, and we need to get them to the action. And suggested course of actions for Ukraine, G7, EU, DFIs, IFOs, investors, and SMEs that implement or planning to invest in Ukraine. Why? Because we have a lot of support, a lot of interest, but coordination, I think, is still at the beginning. And the more coordination we will have, the more finance we will unlock to Ukraine. Now I have two more slides about SME project examples. So what kind of projects are we talking about that needs investment? I think it's very interesting for potential investors, because SME sector in Ukraine, as I said, very strong. We have many companies that have significant track record of doing business in Ukraine, and they are very attractive investment targets. They are not startups. They are companies that can effectively use investment and finance in order to make profits for the company and for the investor. For example, project on restoration of the Ukrainian tomato industry through introduction of industrial production of high-quality tomato paste and supply of high-quality raw materials to food industry enterprises in Ukraine and also throughout the world. So the company is looking for financing, not investment at this stage, in amount of $26 million. They can repay the loan within 3 years, and they would implement this finance, they would use this finance within a year, which is very effective, and they can, this would be a fixed income exercise with some very predictable outcomes, because it's a very good and strong company. Another project, a company operated from 2017. They are planning to build 16,000 square meters greenhouse complex for the all-year hydroponic cultivation of salad greens and flavoring herbs using MGS technology. So the company is looking for $8 million investment. In this case, could be private equity. And they already invested own money in amount of $2.2 million. Payback period 6 years, and project will be implemented to start operation within 1 year from receiving the investment. So we will be working on the pipeline, as I said. There will be tens, hundreds of similar projects, not only from Ukraine, but also from foreign SMEs that are interested in doing business in Ukraine. Ukraine Invest is the government of Ukraine Investment Promotion Office, and we're happy to talk to Ukrainian SMEs or foreign SMEs that want to do business in Ukraine. Talk to them about their pipeline and include them in our list of projects that can be targets for the investment fund, impact investment fund, or a number of investment funds that can be created as a result of this exercise, when we will identify donor capital and we will invite private capital to form these innovative financial and investment mechanisms. Thank you very much. I'd like to pass the floor back to Marina, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. That was brilliant and very informative. And from my point of view, having worked with the international investor community for almost 15 years, I cannot stress enough how effective Sergey's agency is or office is, and how much help they're providing in coordinating efforts and linking interested direct investors or fund managers with specific targets in Ukraine. And they're extremely well connected. So I can't stress enough just how effective this agency is. And now moving on to Natalia Yereska, whom I introduced a few minutes ago. But Natalie, hi again. And just to say that Natalie is former Minister of Finance in Ukraine, and she is now Managing Director with EY. And EY, of course, is one of the world's largest consultancy firms. So Natalie, welcome.
Thank you very much. And I apologize for being delayed. If you would please put my presentation up, that would be helpful. What I wanted to do today was walk through definitionally how the investment community looks at impact and blended finance. There we go. You know, flip to the next page, please. Because I think sometimes these terms get confused, and I think sometimes these terms are used interchangeably when they really are two different things. First, on the left side of the page, you'll see blended finance. And blended finance, as Siddhi was talking about, really unites. Someone's got to shut off their sound. Blended finance really unites private and philanthropic finance. And I mean philanthropic, I mean concessional, I mean non-pure private capital. And by doing this, by bringing together both private and philanthropic concessional finance, you're able to reduce the expected risk return quotient. You're able to reduce the expected return of a particular project, making it more investable. In essence, this is broadening and making much larger the scope of projects that can be investable, because the IRR at the end of the day, because of the blended finance, is assumed to be much lower. As of June of this year, the reported blended finance available in the marketplace for 2022 was $181 billion, and this year it's ranging in the same area. 5,700 total commitments reported in terms of blended finance. And this is a growing area of interest, and it's an area where we have to keep a very good eye out for Ukraine because it's an opportunity. The other, impact investing, really targets allocations of capital to more than one outcome. So yes, they're looking, of course, for a financial return. This isn't charity and these aren't grants, but in addition to the financial return, they have other positive, measurable social and environmental impacts. And those impacts can be measured in a wide variety of ways. Some of the standards link back to ESG principles in a company or in a company's mission, and others link back to the World Bank, to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. The focus is on companies or institutions that promote ethical and socially responsible consciousness that accomplish socially conscious, socially responsible objectives. And examples can be so broad, so wide, that it can practically speaking include anything from environmental sustainability to social justice, corporate ethics. And that's one of the reasons the number you see on this page is so incredibly large, 1.164 trillion of reported impact investments over the last 4 or 5 years, since 2021. And the market continues to get bigger. If you combine these two, you create even a larger amount of capital for Ukraine for the types of investments that Siddhi was describing. You go to the next page. So just to give a couple examples, on the left, what you'll see is current demand for investments in that blue column. That blue column says $2 to $3 trillion measured globally in sustainable development needs. These are identified needs. And the private sector is willing to provide somewhere between 1.1, 1.5 to these needs. And so other sources and need to be identified. The demand in total, as you see for the sustainable development needs, is some $6 trillion. On the right-hand side, you're going to see how it works. You have institutional investors in the top blue box they're going to be the ones investing the majority of capital, and they're the ones that are going to be making sure that there is a financial return as well as an impact return. Below that, you see concessionary investors. Sometimes we call them IFIs, but they can be more than international financial institutions. They can be NGOs. They can be specific types of funds that seek social environmental outcomes. These are typically providing smaller amounts of capital, and they're typically seeking lower returns. They'll even sometimes be willing to accept losses in order to achieve those other impact, those other socially responsible outcomes. So these are the groups that are making the investments. They invest, as you know, in different ways. It can be equity, it can be mezzanine, it can be senior shares. It can be, in the case of the concessionary investors, first loss shares, where they're willing to absorb the higher risks so that the private sector institutional investors can enjoy the returns that they're expecting. And oftentimes, these risks are these investments are de-risked even further with the help and the support of technical assistance. So there may be some pool of funds on the side that provide for consulting, training, and other to the project, not incorporated into the calculation of the returns, not incorporated into the IRRs, such that, again, you can reach certain lower expectations and you have the help of that technical assistance. I think it's important to note that, and we've got some examples here at the bottom, this really does happen all over the world in a wide variety of sectors. So you see here cross-boundary energy access, which was the first blended finance project focused on energy infrastructure in Africa. You see Agribusiness Capital Fund, ABC Fund, which invests in opportunities, expanding economic opportunity and social development for small landholders, small farmers, in particular women and young people. Again, these projects, this blended finance, would identify and target the objective they're trying to achieve. And in some cases, it's women farmers. In some cases, it's small business, microfinance. In other cases, it may be minority-owned businesses. Going further, you'll see FDN, FDN, which funded roads and bridges as part of a road program in the rural areas of Colombia. And lastly, the Tropical Landscape Finance Facility, which enhances smallholder farmer livelihoods by providing them with donor-based grant funding until the stable cash flow gets going. In other words, oftentimes startups will complain that they're unable to achieve financing. Blended finance can be an example if we're finding investors who are willing to provide donor funding for the initial low cash flow period. And go to the next page, please. Impact investing, slightly different, is really focused on stimulating something other than return in addition to returns, boosting governance, stimulating growth. And this network of $1.164 trillion is something that very, very many organizations are engaged in. So there is over 3,300 already registered, acting and working in this manner. And many of them need to come to Ukraine, which is why we're here today. Impact investing organizations are across the globe, as you can see from that global map at the bottom, many in Europe and in the United States, where the practice has been active much longer. And these pure play investors, impact investors, there's some names here, Blue Orchard Finance, Vital Capital Fund. These pure play really are focused on returns in a secondary fashion, if at all. They're measuring their outcomes. They're measuring the success of their projects with different types of reporting, different types of monitoring, and different types of measurable improvements. You see that it starts basically by saying, I have a desire to improve X. Let's call it the use of the practice of small farming. Then they contribute this investment capital. They contribute in addition to the capital, and they contribute technical assistance, they contribute knowledge assistance, training, and then they work to identify how to achieve specific outcomes. So I'll give you just an example of one of these impact investments. There was a healthcare project in Brazil, a $10 million healthcare project by a company called LGT Impact Ventures. And, there is a great deal of Brazil's population that didn't have access to healthcare or relied on poor quality healthcare. So this was the expansion of clinics across a wide variety of the network. And the investment was used to fund the CapEx, to fund the infrastructure, to fund the equipment, and to create a proprietary platform for management of the system. But the impact metrics that were used at the end of the day to measure whether or not that investment was succeeding was the number of low-income patients served, it was the number of medical services being delivered, the number of satisfied clients, and the number of repeat clients. Then it was not about only profit and loss. Profit and loss wasn't in the top 5 measurements of impact that the fund used. Go on, please. Next slide. So, how can we support Ukraine's reconstruction? Well, on the top there, you see what the impacts of this war have been to this economy. The damage has been tremendous. It was tremendous when the war began in 2014 with a 10% decline in 15. But what you also see is the resilience of this economy in terms of bouncing back. And you'll see that again here. The resilience of this economy begs for the type of support that blended finance and impact finance can make. And if we look at much of what Sadie's already said, the areas of opportunity, which have been outlined by the World Bank in their recent damage report, the areas are so broad that they fit into each and every category that impact finance and blended finance have been focused on. This is an opportunity to target, for example, how do we want refugees to come home? What types of investments are going to be necessary to attract the labor pool to come back? We can target demining, and how do we make farmers capable of farming again at the level that they had been farming and feeding the world prior to this? How do we bring demining into that project and finance it to make farming possible? The space for impact investment, the space for blended finance is so broad that my expectation would be that when we see a presentation like this in a few years, you're going to see very, very high numbers on both sides. Our challenge is finding the projects to present and bringing those investors to Ukraine. Next page. I think I just want to say thank you to everyone. I guess there's not a closing page. I want to say thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to take any questions, answer anything I might be able to do to help you identify and work to bring blended finance and impact investing in a big way to Ukraine. Thank you. Marina, we can't hear you.
You see, I followed Natalie's direction to mute myself, and I guess I muted myself permanently. So thank you so much, Natalie. Really appreciate it. Very informative, and we can definitely some questions popping up, which we will cover in Q&A. And we're moving on to our next session now. So part 3, and it's a panel discussion.
There is also Maxim in part 2.
Oh, I'm sorry. Of course. Thank you, Sergio. I'm sorry, I moved on way too fast. So Maxim Barada, of course, project manager. I'm so sorry, Maxim. UNDP. So we had presentation in the very beginning from Yako, and now we have Maxim. So please, Maxim, if you could let us know and tell us about your activity with Ukraine Invest and the analytics and the assessment that you've been doing in the Ukrainian markets and the various options there for investment. I'm so sorry.
Sure. Thanks, Maria. Hello, dear participants, dear colleagues. Indeed, after Sergei's and Natalia's presentations, there is not much to it, but I will maybe try to elaborate a little bit on some of the issues around innovative financial products. Let me start sharing my screen with a brief presentation. What I wanted to talk about is some innovative financial solutions that could potentially support recovery efforts of Ukraine. Let's maybe start with going through some of the challenges that Ukraine is currently facing in its recovery efforts. So first, maybe it's worth mentioning, which is worth mentioning, is the uncertain demographic situation. As you are probably well aware of, as a result of war, more than 8 million people were actually displaced. Of course, the majority of them have already returned, but still the substantial part has not, and we are not sure if they ever will. So this obviously presents a challenge. Then we are also facing high unemployment rate. It is almost 21% in 2023. There are some infrastructure bottlenecks even before the war. Aging and deficient infrastructure stock was a challenge for Ukraine. And after the breakout of the full-scale Russian invasion, the situation has not improved. As a result of the war, Ukraine infrastructure is one of the smallest infrastructure market is one of the smallest in the region in terms of its value. And then there is also damage to energy infrastructure like power, gas, heating infrastructure, coal mining. So it adds up to almost 10 billion of losses as of March 2023. Market volatility is another challenge driven by political and economic volatility stemming from corruption, ambiguous incentive mechanisms, regulations, and also geopolitics. So as a result of that, we face stagnated business activity. There are some, according to the assessments, almost half of the MSMEs has not returned yet to their pre-war operation volumes. Then there is also a low domestic demand and also accessibility of some advanced technology, restrictions on agricultural export, and also ban of grain sales in some of the neighboring countries that we are currently facing. But in addition to those hard challenges that we have to operate under, there are also soft challenges that could be addressed by, let's say, capacity building efforts. For example, there is, in terms of business competencies, there is a lack of financial literacy among entrepreneurs in general, and also lack of trained managerial personnel. We obviously see the insufficient knowledge in terms of financing instruments among MSMEs. There is a lack of capacity and also lack of awareness of the availability and the application process for the financing instrument. That are affordable for small-scale companies. And finally, I would also like to mention the lack of, let's say, comprehensive legal framework for impact investing. It is not in place as such. So what could be the possible solutions around the innovative financing that could help us address and overcome some of those challenges? They were already mentioned, at least the areas they belong to. They were already mentioned in Natalia's presentation. So indeed, those are two interconnected areas of blended finance and impact investing. Natalia has perfectly described and defined them, so I will not be repeating this information, just mention a couple of numbers. So in terms of blended finance, the aggregated blended finance floor has already totaled over 160 billion, and the annual inflow is approximately 9 billion, and it is at this level since almost 2015. However, the proportion of closed blended finance transactions in Europe and Central Asia reached only 4% in 2020. So this obviously indicates a lot of untapped potential. And with regards to impact investing, this is, as for now, rather small, but consistent group of investors in blended finance. They in the total number of blended finance transactions, they represent approximately 40% of commitments between 2018 and 2020. But also only 6% of the existing impact investing assets were channeled towards the region of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We, as UNDP country office, has tried to look closer on the opportunities around the impact investments in Ukraine, and tried to examine the existing ecosystem for impact investing. What we try to do is we basically tried to overlap national SDG targets with some of the opportunity sectors. And this is how we came up with 6 priority industries or sectors. These are the results of pre-war analysis, but we believe it is still relevant. So those priority industries that are attractive for impact investments are as follows. Technology with a focus on IT industry and digital economy, then also infrastructure, renewable energy, healthcare, education, and agriculture. But then we decided to basically look at those sectors even closer, and we have applied a global tool that UNDP uses across the world to examine the opportunities for SDG-oriented investments. This is called SDG Investor Map. So it was produced for Ukraine, also before the breakout of the full-scale Russian invasion, but we also believe most of the results are still valid. So I will know it has this SDG Investor Map has identified 20 opportunity areas for advancing private sector progress towards SDGs. For the sake of time, I will of course not go through all those areas. You will have you could refer to this list if this is something of an interest for you, because the presentations will be shared. But basically, priority sectors, they are quite close to the results of our previous analysis of the impact investment ecosystem. So this would be a value chain around food and beverage. Then it is also infrastructure, renewable and alternative energy solution, transportation, and technology and communication. And I will conclude with mentioning some of the focus areas for financial products that could help us unlock access to blended finance, including impact investments during the crisis settings we currently operate in. So those solutions are structured around 4 priority areas, starting with mine action finance, because obviously this is one of the biggest challenges and barriers for agricultural sector. So offering financial solutions in this area could help unlock the land value and also support the recovery of the entire sector. Then obviously solutions around war insurance are very much needed and required for the country in the war, during the war. SME finance solution, and indeed, as Sergei has mentioned in his presentation, SMEs represent the backbone of Ukrainian economy. They are currently suffering from limited access to finance, from limited availability of collateral, and also they lack capacity to run their business in line with SDGs, which does not allow them basically to access those opportunities around SDG-driven and impact-oriented investments. And finally, well, the solutions around so-called multi-purpose finance are required because problem areas during the war situation could be complex, and various solutions, various needs should be addressed. I will not go into details of specific financial products in each of those 4 areas, but just mention that we are partnering and working closely with Ukrainian government, including Ministry of Economy, including Ukraine Invest, and we are developing specific products under each of those areas. We will be soon presenting them, communicating, promoting them, and hopefully also offering them, making them available to Ukrainian MSMEs. Thank you for your attention, dear colleagues.
Thank you,
Marina,
Maxim. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's great. And just so you know, we have about 500 attendees. So obviously there is a lot of interest in Ukraine, probably more than ever before. So thank you all very much. And I think what is very helpful is that aside, to Ukrainian situation, impact investment and ESG is just one of the probably largest trends in the investment world, full stop. And that trend is on the rise as never before. So I think the combination, despite what's going on, I think the current situation has also presented with amazing opportunities to those investors who are looking to participate in impact and ESG, and Ukraine is probably one of the hottest markets in that area at the moment for understandable reasons. And sorry, I just got a correction. We have actually not only 500 attendees, but also representatives from 50 countries. So welcome to all of you. I know we're presenting in Ukrainian and English. Probably next time we'll add some additional languages here. And moving on to the next part, we're doing perfect on timing. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Maria Håkansson, Managing Director and CEO of Swedfund. Hello, Maria.
Hello, Marina. Thank you so much, and very nice to be here this afternoon and to be part of this very important discussion on Ukraine. So, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to severe humanitarian sufferings, economic and political consequences, and I think they have been well described by so many other speakers, also highlighting in a very good way all the gaps and all the consequences. So I will not spend time on repeating that. My reflection is that it's really important, but also very impressive to see the resilience of the Ukrainian economy, and that the country is able to work on reforms, recovery, and reconstruction, actually in the middle of a war. And I also think if you look upon it from an opportunity perspective, the reconstruction will actually also provide an opportunity to modernize Ukraine's economy. And there are so many assets, I think, to build on. Ukraine has a well-educated and skilled population, a strong industrial base to build on. And if you look on the resilience of the private sector, it's really remarkable, where still a very large share of companies are operating and planning for the future. And of course, as we have heard, there are companies where personnel or infrastructure have been impacted. But according to a study that I read from the EBRD, only 6% have been forced to suspend their operations, which I think, considering the circumstances, is really remarkable. Before I became the CEO of Swedfund, I worked for almost 20 years in Ericsson. So I have a long experience from the IT and digitalization sector. And I think the IT sector is really a good example of a sector that has quickly adapted in Ukraine and that really has shown that it is resilient. And if I understand it correctly, it actually also shown growth in 2022. So, of course, I'm therefore very proud that Swedfund, together with a number of other DFIs, have invested in SMEs in the IT sector through the fund Horizon Capital. And really what we want to achieve as an investor here is to contribute to an increased access of growth capital, to really enable these companies to continue their growth journey, to create jobs. And I think also it has good effects for the country because it will also contribute to increased export revenues, access to hard currency, and also tax revenues. For me, on a more personal note, it provided me with an opportunity to visit Kyiv at the end of April. And it is a city that in my previous capacity then at Ericsson has actually visited quite a number of times. And it was so good to see that Kyiv is still a very lively city. And I was extremely impressed by the strong and resilient companies that I met during these days. And I think this is a good example of exactly what you're talking about in this previous presentation. I mean, it really testifies to the competence and potential in the IT sector that we see in Ukraine, but also the role that DFIs like Swedfund can play in providing risk-willing and long-term capital to really enable entrepreneurs and SMEs to grow and scale their business. I think in our role as DFIs, we are also extremely important in that we are additional, that we are willing to take the risk and actually go into invest and make investments happen. And by that also actually providing that extremely important link and bridge to the private capital that you were highlighting in the previous slides. We were also very honored that when we were in Kyiv for the signing ceremony, President Zelensky attended the ceremony. And he underlined the importance of trust and of investors really leading the way and showing that it's possible to make investments and that Ukraine is really open for business. And I really share that view that it's extremely important to provide those extremely concrete examples. I mean, in some of the previous slides, we have seen examples of sectors where there are huge needs. And I think it's also what are those specific investments? Are there good examples to share? And if you look on the DFIs, I mean, you can in one way say that we are impact investors. For us, the starting point is really what is the impact that we can create in terms of jobs, access to essential services like electricity or food or financial services, but also how we can, for example, invest in areas like digitalization to really accelerate the development. So that's where we start. Then I think the other part, if you talk about ESG that you mentioned, Marina, I think it's extremely important that things are done in a sustainable way. It's both from the environmental perspective, it's that it's socially done, that we really can offer decent working conditions. And then, of course, always extremely important to address the governance and the anti-corruption measures. And I think for us, what we see is this is where we can really contribute. It's in normal cases for us as a DFI, the area where we see that the risks can be very high, but also an area where we can really contribute and add value. So I think the other side of the DFI is not only from a capital perspective, but really what we can see is that we come in. We normally say that our capital comes with requirements, but also with support. And by working with different companies on actually improving the way they work with ESG, we, in a one way, also become a quality stamp for other investors, whether it's institutional investors or other impact investors, saying that when a DFI has been there, we have really helped to really address those questions, making sure that there are actually capabilities and competence, because it's not around the measurements. I think it's extremely important to make sure that the companies that we invest in, that we really equip them to work with those questions. And I think just on a side note, we saw after the pandemic that those companies that have really worked with ESG in a structured way, they actually manage much more better financially. And I think that has to do with having a very structured approach to how you actually work with risks, but also with value creation. So it's the impact, it's the sustainability, which is really the how you do it. And then the third area is that, I mean, when we invest, we want it to be financially viable. Because if that is not there, then, I mean, all of the efforts that we put in will be in vain unless we can really see that there is, I mean, a runway to a positive return and to positive cash flows. And I think it's also extremely important because that is required if we want to attract all of that different capital. So if I look at Ukraine, I think, and I can only, I mean, agree upon that there is a huge need, but I also see that there is a huge potential in many sectors. But what needs to happen is, I mean, there's many different actors that will need to come together. And it's, I mean, it's an extraordinary situation. So it will also require something extra from all of us. I fully share the important view actually having concessional financing, because I think for all of us, even for DFIs, there is a need for risk mitigation. And I think that is key to get that piece into the puzzle. And I also think the war or the insurance part is extremely important to resolve. But all in all, I think if we're going to resolve this, I think it's actually a collaboration between both public and private actors that is needed. And I think it's extremely important that we find different kind of vehicles where we can coordinate this work. And I think at the end of the day, it has to be the needs of Ukraine that is the guiding light for all of us. That's kind of what determines where the money goes. So from a DFI perspective, I mean, we find Ukraine very important and very interesting. So we have done the investments as I described in Horizon Capital, but we also made investments in Ukraine even before the war, then mostly in renewable energy. And in general, the sectors we focus on are energy and climate. It is digitalization. It is financial inclusion, which is from a broader perspective, actually to increase access to funding to SMEs. And then we do what we call more sustainable enterprises, where we also include thematic areas like the food sector and healthcare services. So I think I'll stop there and hand over back to you, Marina.
Thank you, Maria. I have to say that I deal a lot with DFIs and Swedfund as a client as well. And our next speaker, the name of the fund screams ESG and impact. So I'm sure you will be very interested to hear as to what Konstantin has to say. But I totally confirm and agree with you that DFI, the whole purpose of DFIs is to support impact and ESG throughout the world. And obviously there's a lot of that going on in various emerging markets. And I'm very happy to see that Ukraine, not for good reasons, but at the same time has opened up to DFIs. So thank you so much. And now moving on to Konstantin Mogiletsky, co-founder of Ukraine Green Recovery Fund. And I just thought the name just screams ESG to me. So Konstantin, the floor is yours. If Konstantin is joining. Okay, why don't we just switch the order? If we could please move on to Amit Shah. I see Amit is here, Investment Director at Bridges Fund Management.
I am here.
Welcome.
Thank you. No, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a really, really interesting presentation, and lots of themes that I wanted to touch on have been said already. But here at Bridges, I am a director in our outcomes partnerships team, where we support the creation and management of outcomes contracting and social impact bonds, which is one use case for impact investing, and one way that impact investing can be mobilized. And we are an impact investor, and we've mobilized now well over $200 million of funding globally to support outcomes contracting. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how outcomes contracting could be an interesting tool and an interesting way to mobilize impact investing in the context of Ukraine. I think what we'll probably see in the aftermath, or in the current and aftermath of the challenging situation that Ukraine is in, is a flow of funds from organizations, from development organizations, as well as funds within the government to kind of redevelop and redesign both the social economy as well as the real economy. And the opportunity exists to redesign those systems and services which are encouraged to improve the lives of Ukrainians in a way that is more aligned with what those services are intending to achieve. And that's where outcomes contracting comes in. And I'll now just share my screen. I've got a very short presentation that I will try and run through quickly. Just give me 1 second. Just let me know you can see my screen. So what we have is an outcomes partnership or an outcomes contract. Basically consists of two components. So you have a funder, which is often government, a donor, a corporate who has some outcomes that they want to achieve. In the context of something like Ukraine, there could be, and hearing some of the challenges that I've heard today, there's some challenges around employment, there could be some challenges around displaced people, problems that need to be solved, and outcomes that need to be achieved. And what an outcomes contract does is it redefines how that funder pays for the service. So rather than pay for the service to be delivered, they pay for the outcomes of that service to be achieved. And then they ask delivery organizations and delivery partnerships to come in and bid for or to achieve the outcomes that they want. And if the outcomes are achieved, they will then pay that delivery partnership for the services that have been achieved. So how is this different from traditional servicing? So the boxes on the red are kind of how traditional procurement and traditional services are managed. So you have a problem that you wish to address. You'll then have the government or the donor agency defining a solution to that problem, setting a budget, and then asking delivery organizations to deliver on that exact specification. And then the funder will pay irrespective of whether the outcomes are achieved or not, or whether the results are achieved or not. On the outcomes contracting side, we define actually what success looks like. So the funder will define what are we trying to get out of this. They will then select the outcomes to be achieved, to be paid for. Delivery partners will then be encouraged to deliver on those outcomes, and they will have the flexibility to iterate and innovate to be able to achieve on those outcomes. So actually the service will shift based on what is needed to deliver on those outcomes. And then the funder will only pay if those outcomes are achieved. So if this works well, we see sort of very good alignment, innovation, better outcomes for people, and better value of services is kind of what we hope for if this methodology of contracting is achieved. And how does this catalyze investment? So if you think of any service, and if we take education as an example, if you deliver education today, you actually won't see the outcomes of that delivery often for a year or 2 years after the service has been delivered. So actually the costs you're incurring now of delivery, and so for example with education, you're delivering the services in schools today and maybe next year, and then you're measuring the outcomes of that service, and actually the outcomes will happen 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. And so the payment for the outcomes come in 2 to 3 years after the service has been delivered. So actually that opens up a gap, a working capital need. And where impact investors can come in is to fill that working capital need, supporting organizations who are delivering on the outcomes to be able to do that delivery, to be able to fund that delivery, and then can take on the risk of those outcomes actually happening. And that's what organizations like we do. So why do this? Because it leads to more outcomes. We believe it creates innovation in service delivery. So for example, in COVID, we run a bunch of family therapy services in the UK where a child would have been taken into care, where a child within the family would be taken into care. And we said to the government, rather than that child going into the care, we'll deliver this therapeutic service. Now in COVID, actually therapy was very hard to deliver, but we were actually very quick to change our therapy delivery to online. We've actually bought iPads for the families involved and allowed that service delivery to change. It also can bring together a range of stakeholders to address problems. So we can build quite complex partnerships to address problems, and creates a culture of joint problem solving to address those problems. Where can this work? So we've got a range of areas where we've done contracts where I think could be interesting and important for Ukraine as the country moves into recovery from this challenging situation. Areas like homelessness and employment we've heard about already are big challenges, and we've got contracts in the UK and abroad in both those areas. We're currently working in Turkey where there's a large youth unemployment problem to support and address that problem there. Refugee settling, there's a program we're running in the UK to support displaced peoples to be able to settle into new areas. Health and education are big areas. So in education, we're currently working in Sierra Leone and Ghana to improve the quality of schooling, as well as in the UK as well. And in health, we are currently running a lot of programs in the UK around social prescribing, which is a program to kind of bring the social element back into healthcare delivery, alongside the medicalization of many problems. All of these areas have clear outcomes that can be defined and clear outcomes that can be paid for, that could be then conduits for areas like impact investing. And I think could play an important role in how Ukraine successfully moves into a flourishing way after the current situation. And yeah, it's really been really inspiring to hear the speakers before me and I think there could be an opportunity for outcomes contracting to fit alongside a lot of the other very exciting work that will happen over the next few years. Thanks, Marina.
Absolutely, Amit. Yes, absolutely right. And these focus areas obviously are extremely important. I have to say health being probably one of the big ones and ongoing issues. And now I'm going to backtrack a little bit and introduce Konstantin again. Konstantin Mogiletsky, co-founder of Ukraine Green Recovery Fund. Konstantin, I can see you with us.
Fantastic. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Great. May I ask my presentation?
Just a second, please.
Okay, let me start while we will launching the presentation. So I represent Green Ukraine Recovery Fund. Yes. And we are focused on renewables and logistics. Yes, before that I was a partner at Horizon Capital and worked there for more than 13 years. Yes, next slide, please. May I ask next slide? Sorry. Yeah, so I don't think I have to stop a lot here. We know that there are huge damages by estimates of the World Bank and others. It's more than $400 billion. Unfortunately, they grow a lot. So a lot of work to be done to recover this. Next slide, please. And obviously, like the best time to invest into Ukraine is now. That's what the European Investment Bank president is saying, and many others, for the obvious reasons. Yes, because a lot of reforms were done, and there are like a lot of opportunities in our country, and actually, in particular, in green as well. Yes, Ukraine joined European Green Deal. There is Ukraine can export now energy to Europe, and so on. I would like to focus on the last slide, the next one, which is like the most relevant for our event. So, importance of blended finance and innovative finance. Yes. So the situation which we have in Ukraine now is that, unfortunately, for the good reasons, most of the financing is now going into the public sector of Ukraine. Yes, we can read, like yesterday, I believe, $200 million for Ukrainian Railways, before that for Ukrenergo, and many other organizations. And obviously, to support Ukrainian budget. And this is very important, what the donors and development institutions are doing. But unfortunately, to quote one of the leaders of one of the largest investors in Ukraine, 95% of the Western financing for Ukraine is now going into the public sector. Yes. And what it basically means, it means that organizations like which I've mentioned, Ukrenergo or Ukrainian Railways, their clients are not getting financing now. Yes. And that means like, for Ukrainian Railways to function, their clients need goods, yes, to be transported, for example, or for Ukrenergo, the electricity should be consumed. And these companies do need financing. Yes, unfortunately, if you're a Ukrainian company from the real estate, from the real sector, yes, you're from production, or from renewables, whatever, there is basically not a single investment fund to whom you can go to now into Ukraine. In Ukraine, yes, we are like a year and a half into the war almost, and unfortunately, there is not a single investment fund which is investing in Ukrainian real sector now. A very important milestone was achieved last year and this year when organizations like EBRD, IFC, Swedbank invested in the Horizon Capital. And that's a huge, very important step for the positive investment climate in Ukraine. Yes. But Horizon is focused on the tech sector primarily, yes, and but majority of the economy and majority of the job is still a real sector. So the next fund which development institutions should do is to support a private sector and to create at least one or better more funds which would be investing into the Ukrainian real sector, so that jobs would be created, their GDP would be created, taxes would be paid, and so on. So. What I would like to discuss shortly today is that EBRD actually was the first who did a very good innovation here, so-called what they call blended financing, 50-50% financing. The ratio actually, I understand, depends from the projects, but on average it's 50-50. So what it means is that, say there is like a $20 million project which EBRD wants to provide a loan to, and EBRD has $10 million of guarantees from American government, and they put their own $10 million, and the American government is taking, say, this $10 million loss if something goes wrong, yes, with this debt. And that allows EBRD to keep its balance sheet healthy, yes, because the biggest reason why Ukrainian private sector is getting so little financing, unfortunately, yes, from the development institutions in particular, is because all of them are regulated banking institutions, yes, and they all say openly, like, for example, the president of EIB said this year in January in Davos at Ukrainian House, he said, please put more pressure on European politicians so that the EIB could finance more projects in Ukraine. The EIB, to finance projects in Ukraine, needs guarantees from European Union, yes? Or recently at the energy conference in London, EBRD representative said that, look, there is the situation, there is this ranking thing and so on. We need guarantees from the Western donors to provide financing for more projects in Ukraine. And basically, such approaches like which I'm showing here, and one of the examples in the West is Green for Growth Fund, which had a similar structure, is that when we have a multi-layer structure of financing, for example, for investment fund, yes, say we have a donor, let's say it's USAID, yeah, just an example, yeah, in terms of USAID, who is providing the $10 million, say it's a $100 million fund. Yes, if you're talking about investment fund. Say USAID is providing $10 million and they are taking the first hit. Yes, then we have development institutions, say it's DFC from US, EBRD, IFC, and others who are like taking the next risk. Yes, and then the top of it, we have a private sector because as investors. Because that's the most important. The private sector is the best investor for the obvious reasons. They made money, they know how to make money, they have technologies because Ukraine needs not just technologies, but also, not just money, but also technologies. Because the Ukrainian government, absolutely correct, was to say that in Ukrainian energy sector, we don't have to rebuild the Soviet infrastructure. We should build a new one. And for this, we need, again, technologies from the West. Unfortunately, again, Ukrainian public sector, same as public sector in any country, is far from perfect, and the Ukrainian private sector is much more efficient. Yeah, just one example is that recently, I believe it was National Bank who announced that more than 50% of the banks, of the public, of the government-owned banks in Ukraine, more than half of their balance sheet is bad debt. Yes, NPL. And for private banks, it's like 20% something. The difference is more than 2 times. So that's the difference which we are talking now about in terms of efficiency of investments by public sector and private sector in Ukraine. And that's why it's especially important that donors would provide financing for the private sector in Ukraine, because for each dollar which you invest into the private sector of Ukraine, you will get much better returns, much more jobs than if you support the public sector. Obviously, the public sector is also very important, but it should be a combination. Yes, now we have a situation when 90–95% financing from the West is going, unfortunately, to the public sector, which is very bad situation in the short term and in the long term for the private sector in Ukraine. So structures which we are describing here, and we are happy to share this experience and analytics, is very important to be launched so that finally private investors could start coming to Ukraine. Ukraine Invest is doing a great job by bringing Serzanit, Kronospan, and others who are investing during the war, which is amazing in my view. But we are a big country, it's huge losses, and we need, for the obvious reasons, much more financing and support. Thank you. That's it from my side.
Thank you, Konstantin. That is very interesting. And it's very practical as well. So I think if the audience, if you have questions about, maybe you want to hear about examples, how go about making an investment in Ukraine, or how, for example, any questions from that Konstantin can talk to, given his experience with Horizon Capital, please make sure that you put that in the chat and we can cover in the Q&A session. And we have Pavlo. I can see Pavlo Kartashov here, director of the Ukrainian Startup Fund. Pavlo, please, the floor is yours.
Irina, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Pavlo, and I'm CEO of Ukrainian Startup Fund, which is also known as Ukrainian Innovation Development Fund. Basically, probably I will introduce USF and our activities, just to make sure everyone understands what we are doing and how it works. So can you see my screen, Marina? Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, so basically, just a bit of history. Ukrainian Startup Fund, we started our operational activity in 2019, and from that time we have several programs. So what we are doing, we are building startup ecosystem in Ukraine, obviously designing different programs and different instruments to make sure we have more and more startups set up. So from the beginning, we launched two main core programs. So it was 25 and 50K grants for pre-seed and seed stage startups. And for time being, we already financed 320 startups. Also, another program is acceleration program. So we brought into Ukraine, we introduced into Ukraine, I believe, the best accelerators, international accelerators. And they actually launched their program together with USF. So USF was covering the cost of acceleration program, and startup actually choose any of them to make sure they have the best matching. Another program which was recently launched before the war, it was program of innovative voucher. So we started bring Ukrainian tech delegations, so both startup and IT companies, they are joining us, and we actually showcasing Ukrainian tech ecosystem as the biggest event like CES, Viva Tech, Web Summit, TechCrunch, Collision, and many others. So just making sure that first of all Ukraine represented at the proper level. Secondly, we are connecting startups with the biggest VCs and investors worldwide. And another added value is that we have the biggest media at the tech conferences, which are actually promoting Ukraine as a tech country. Also, once the war started, we launched our dual use program. So basically, we defined 5 focuses. These are defense, infrastructure, cybersecurity, education, and healthcare. So making sure that we will find the decisions or ideas or innovations which will help us to tackle these new obstacles which occurred during the war. For example, any educational platform which will help relocated people, especially children, to get education. That is actually, in our understanding, this dual use project, and we support such cases. So as for now, we already finance more than 40 projects, and program is still ongoing. And last but not least, recently we launched a MilTech cluster called Brave One. It's actually our attempt to, it's joint initiative of different ministries like Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Strategic Industries, and also Security Council and many others. It's common initiative to identify those projects which are currently in Ukraine, and to make sure, first of all, they have access to finance. Secondly, they have access to state procurement, and another options which are provided in MilTech cluster. This is access to R&D, access to testing fields, and many obviously access to VCs and many other opportunities. So basically, this is all initiatives we're doing right now. And yes, one more thing I need to mention. Recently, we won 20 million grant from European Union, and we are part of consortium, which is consisting of 21 companies, and most of them are European companies. So basically, in September, we are planning to launch a new program. 12 million euros will be allocated to Ukrainian deep tech startups. So as for now, my personal opinion and my personal feeling that we have enough of international support, we have enough of financing. So our main task and goal now is just to make audit of all the projects which are at universities, private innovators, R&D centers, and so on, and make sure we are providing the vehicles. If, for example, we have some innovations where we are to provide a vehicle to commercialize this innovation. So as for now, we already connected 100 plus Ukrainian universities. We are communicating with them on a daily basis. And obviously, we are preparing for the launch of big programs because in addition to grants, we'll be providing a lot of different opportunities, and there are will be a lot of different events, especially in European Union. And also recently we attended Deep Tech Summit in Stockholm. It's EU Deep Tech Summit, where we have a lot of commitments because there are huge interest from international community to Ukraine, and especially to deep tech industry. So that is our current status. I'll give you some examples. So you see here, just for the 3 months of this year, some of the startups raised a lot of investments. Basically, just several examples. Obviously, there are more investments. What we see now that there are a lot of different opportunities, and for example, we are now in London Tech Week, and yesterday I was informed that there are a new fund of 20 million VC fund created especially for Ukrainian startups. So basically, we already started negotiations, and we will be offering those startups which will get grant from USF in deep tech industry. Obviously, we will be proposing to VC to co-finance and co-invest into startups directly. And there are more initiatives. So as for now, we are talking to probably 3 or 4 big stakeholders, and we're expecting more funds available for Ukrainian startups. Obviously, USF is dealing with grants only. So basically, if we are talking about equity, probably we will be using some other mechanism. But obviously it will be connected to our main activities, to our grant programs. Yeah, and this slide shows how we created the ecosystem. Basically, we have our own platform for which we are coordinating all the activities, and we're communicating with all the stakeholders. We also have more than 60 corporates as partners of USF, and we are doing a lot of activities with them. For example, recently we did a pitch for Glova, a main office in Spain. So basically they selected several startups, which first of all get some grant money, and secondly they went to Spain for pilots. And I believe we will be using this instrument more actively. So because there are huge interest from corporates, especially here in the EU, and we'll be connecting them and matching them to Ukrainian startups. What else? So basically, we are open to any cooperation. So I presume a lot of people from different countries watching us now. So basically, if you have any interest in establishing contacts with the Ukrainian Startup Fund, or maybe Miltech Initiative, or any other activity. You have QR code here, all the contacts there. So yeah, feel free to contact us. We're ready for discussion, cooperation, and obviously we need to make Ukraine glorious and peaceful country. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavlo. Just to mirror what you are saying, I actually on my side see a lot of interest from managers looking to invest in Ukrainian startups. So I think part of our task, our joint task, is to link those startups with the money. And obviously that requires a bit of education and just spreading the word. But I have to say that's probably one of the very interesting areas specifically for private capital. So thank you so much. And with that, we are moving on to our Q&A session. We are doing perfect on timing. We have about 25 minutes. I have plenty of questions. I will not be able to cover all of them, but where we don't cover a question, don't worry. We will get back to you with a more detailed answer. And obviously, if the answer is high level, we can provide more detail if needed. And I would just like to kick off with the question, which was actually the first question from Ian Morgan, and that question was addressed to me. So I will start, and perhaps if others would want to pick up from that, that'll be great. So the question relates about the investor, so the fund sponsor and private equity community, and in general, like what do I see in my experience, you know, being on the fund formation side, now in the US and previously in Europe. What do I see and what sort of requirements I see from those parties with regard to the investment landscape in Ukraine, and what sort of conditions that investors are looking for, what sort of protections, presumably, in order to deploy significant funds to reconstruction of Ukraine. So obviously, you know, I can spend 10 hours on the subject, so this will be very high level, but I think the devil is always in detail, right? What sort of investors are we talking about? Obviously, there's an elephant in the room, which is the war that Russia started in Ukraine, right? And that is a big elephant in the room that needs to be addressed, and the international investor community needs to be made comfortable that they can go into Ukraine and there are ways of minimizing the risks despite the ongoing war. So that's unique to Ukraine at the moment, but at the same time, there are also unique solutions, right? So for example, we've been talking about the military and political risk insurance, and we will cover that in the next question, but that is a solution that could help in theory, and again I say the devil is in detail, but it could help in theory minimize those risks. And when it comes to other things, I don't think that Ukraine is different to any other emerging market from my point of view. You know, I deal with a lot of funds that go into the African countries, that go in Latin America, that go in Asia, and there are very similar trends in all of these emerging markets that can be, you know, that you need to work with. And in terms of the requirements, it very much depends on what type of investor you're talking about. Because, you know, we heard from Swedfund, from Maria, DFIs have very specific set of rules that need to be met. And it doesn't matter if it's Ukraine, if it's, you know, South Africa or elsewhere, there are specific rules, and a lot of these rules are about ESG and the way that investments are being done and implemented on the ground, because obviously DFIs have very limited control to diligence what's actually going on the ground, right? So DFIs have certain very specific requirements. At the same time, DFIs are very open, and their prime mandate is to go into those emerging markets and make an impact. So it's kind of, you know, it's chicken and egg. So you want to have your DFIs because they help you, they kickstart your fund, they are prepared to take the risk, but you have to comply with their very specific requirements. Then you have institutional investors. They have different requirements as well, right? They're a little bit more concerned about making the return they want to make. So you need to make sure that you are, you know, very solid on your financials and you have a lot of backing for your projections, given the context of the jurisdiction you go into and the various risks that are associated with it. Then you have high net worth individuals and private investors, right? They have different concerns. You obviously, one of the concerns, you need to make sure that your structure, your fund structure is bulletproof, that you're not creating any burdens for your investors in terms of tax, in terms of regulation. So, you know, many investors that are a little cautious about Ukraine, I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that Ukraine as an investment jurisdiction is just unknown, right? People just don't know what's going on there. They are not yet familiar with that regulatory regime, with the taxation. Ukraine has been very accommodating, specifically since the war began, to foreign investors. They've introduced a number of incentives and, for example, you know, tax breaks, and I don't know if Sergio would want to cover that later, but there's a lot going on now that didn't happen 5 years ago that makes Ukraine a very attractive jurisdiction to foreign investment, despite the objective risk of the military conflict. So I think the devil is in detail, but that's kind of high-level picture. And I just want to move on to the next question because I have actually a number of questions about that, and I'll give the floor, I think, to Sergio in the first instance. So there are quite a few questions about the military and political risk insurance, what that means, and to what extent that's available. So Sergio, if you would like to pick up this one.
Thank you, Marina. Yes, this is in the process. Yes, so we had some progress from agencies like, from institutions like MIGA, World Banks, and USDFC. So MIGA are considering projects right now. Their main, the main focus of the program is to cover foreign investment in Ukraine only. At the same time, USDFC can consider projects from any country that will invest in Ukraine, so not necessarily with the US link. Also, we have been talking to ECAs from G7 countries. I have met personally with CEO of SACE, and I was reassured that SACE is ready to cover Italian investment in Ukraine. Also, there are other agencies, as I said, like Ministry of Economy of Germany, for example. So they are happy to look at German investments in Ukraine in order to provide insurance. But we will need way more. And it's a very general talk when we talk about war insurance as such, because war insurance should be divided in different kind of baskets as well. So we're talking about physical damage. Are we talking about some commercial risks connected to this, to supply chain disruptions, you know, things like that? And the conference that will be held in London next week on 21st and 22nd will give some answers to that. I know that agencies and institutions will be making some announcements, so I encourage you to sign up and to watch conference probably online. It's very hard to get offline because it's a huge interest from throughout the world. So there will be a special session on investment insurance, announcement, and many other interesting aspects. We as Ukrainian Invest can support Ukrainian companies that are looking for investment insurance. You can submit investment project to us, and we will forward this to international partners that can cover. And again, it depends what kind of project. Is it purely Ukrainian project, or it's a JV, for example, Ukrainian-German JV, where Ministry of Economy of Germany can cover the part of that. So I will send now my email address. So if you have a specific investment project, you can send to us. If you have an investment idea, it's not going to fly, it's not going to work, because agencies need to assess specific investment case. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Sergey. And the next question I'd like to, so there's a lot of questions about DFI support in general and how that works. And one of the questions, and I'm just summarizing several questions actually. If you go into a fund, if you try to raise a fund that will be reliant on DFIs, partially on private capital, right? So for example, institutional investors or high net worth individuals, how do you achieve, and I think where the questions are getting to, how do you achieve the right rate of return for all of the investors? Because obviously DFIs may be prepared to invest on certain terms, and private investors perhaps would want higher returns. So how does this blended finance works in terms of how do you give enough return to those who are not DFIs? And the question was actually addressed to Maxim and Natalie, but whoever would like to pick this one up.
Well, I can comment, but I believe Maria is positioned to answer this question, Natalie. So in short, like if you look at the risk profile of Ukraine now, and if you like look at the internal risk politics of the DFIs and IFIs, for example, for Ukraine, the internal, and we take the standard policy, yes, the internal rate of the projects, which some of them, it's not public here, but I can tell without the details, it's like 45% IRR, which they need to achieve on equity investments for Ukraine. Obviously, like 45% IRR is very aggressive number. Yes, it's if someone is promising it, I should be very careful with such fund. So realistically, I think like the tech funds can promise 25% or around that. Yes, maybe 30. And if we are talking about real sector funds, it's 15% or around that. So the standard approaches of investments into Ukrainian investment funds from DFIs and IFIs, they wouldn't work in this situation. That's why we are talking about this conference about innovative financing, about having blended financing, about having organizations like USAID or others providing cheaper financing maybe, or there are such approaches when there is like some grants being provided to improve the returns of the fund for less risky investors or investors who need higher returns and things like this. Because otherwise, like real sector funds, they cannot be raised to Ukraine. If you're a tech company from Ukraine, you can raise money if you have revenues outside of Ukraine and you don't have significant tangible assets. If you're like a real sector company, even with experts, but with physical assets in Ukraine, there is no one you can talk to so far.
I think like this, I think it's a very difficult question to answer because you cannot set the specific rate on what the DFI needs. I mean, we make a risk assessment. We invest on commercial terms. We are willing to take a much higher risk, but we are not in the one way, trying to distort market rates and so on. So I think it's also to be very careful and mindful of the situation. Then I share Konstantin's view that, if you are in the IT and tech sector, which was kind of my example, I think it's very sector agnostic where, how you judge the risk and the structure in different sectors. So there, we have been making an investment that includes no concessional financing at all. So, but on the other hand, if you look on the infrastructure sector, I think the situation will be completely different. So it's not possible, I think, to give that kind of answer on what is required. I think you have to look at the overall structure of the fund. And then I guess I'm not, as the CEO, the right person to answer. Then I guess you will need to turn to someone in my investment team on what kind of return rates that are required for different structures.
Right. Thank you. Natalie, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I'll just add that part of the idea of doing blended finance is using sources of funds that had lower expected returns, whether it's mezzanine finance or other, which then enables higher returns for those private sector investors who are paired. So there will be different returns for the different forms of capital. And in essence, by using some of the more concessionally priced finance in a blended finance deal, you're enabling higher returns for perhaps the institutional private sector investor. So if there's a pool of technical assistance money, grant money, for example, that would otherwise be a cost of doing business, but is instead taking off some of the costs, that enables the profitability even immediately to be higher than if those costs were being taken by the firm itself. So I think part of the idea is looking for investors who have different expected rates of return, who will use financial tools that both reduce costs at the business because you've got a lower cost of capital, debt capital, for example, using mezzanine, and at the same time, improve somewhat the returns for the private sector.
Right. Correct. And in relation to that, okay, so in terms of, and I think what's important to also note that, because I see there are a number of questions asking about reconstruction as if it's, you know, all you have to do is to invest money in nuclear plants. Just don't forget, we're trying to cover investment in private sector here, which can take all types of forms, right? So it doesn't have to be, well, if I go into Ukraine, I have to invest in nuclear plants. You could invest in like in a startup fund, right? You could cover an IT sector, or there's so many other possibilities out there. Obviously, Ukraine has certain focus areas, but the asset class, it's very much asset class agnostic. And one question I have here, so again, about DFI support, but also the support of the Ukrainian government. How do you go about seeking that support, and whether how those decisions are made? And maybe we can start with the Ukrainian government support. And Sergey, if you could cover that one, please.
Yeah, so there are two questions. It's about how EBRD make an assessment of the case. So, well, they do this case by case, obviously. I guess the question is about financing or investment into the project. So that would be question to EBRD. You can approach them. And when we talk about support of Ukraine, yes, we do have systems for state incentives, for example, for investments. We have the law on state support for significant investments. If you invest 20 million euros or more, then you can get up to 30% of state support of the capex made into investment. We have drafted a proposal that was supported by the Ministry of Economy, by the Prime Minister of Ukraine, and now it has been passed to the Parliament, and it has passed. It was passed in its first reading, and there will be second reading probably end of June, in July. So the threshold will be decreased to 12 million euros, and there will be more kind of deregulated approach to process when you apply for this state support. All information is on our website. You can just Google, you can type in Ukraine Invest Guide, and there will be a special section on investment incentives. You can read about that. And also, when you need a more detailed answer and detailed consultation on specific project, you can send us an email and we will assign a manager to your investment case. So I ask you to do that. And then you will be able to get, like, for example, up to 10 years corporate income tax relief. You can get a loan on a kind of non-interest basis or just a grant for doing activity in Ukraine. So please do read the guide. If you have a specific question, email us and we'll explain to you.
Thank you, Sergey. And there's one question, probably is going to be our last given the time. It was maybe not the last one, but one of the questions is that when the rebuild will start, as if it's some sort of like, you know, a start point for the investment. I just want to, you know, just think about this. The rebuild has not stopped. The rebuild started with the first damage that was done to Ukraine. So it's a continuing effort, an ongoing effort that is accelerating. So it's not about when it's going to kick off. It kicked off. It's about finding more ways and more opportunities and avenues for specifically for global investor community to enter Ukraine. And I don't know, Sergey, if it's worth spending just a minute on that as to the various efforts, maybe geographically, how you've seen if there are any tendencies as to, you know, which parts of Ukraine have been kind of subject to heavy reconstruction as opposed to others. Obviously, there is a wait and see game with some of the areas, right? But I don't know if it's worth, or any of the audience saying what your sense is in terms of, has it started yet? When did it start? And what the future holds?
You mean the reconstruction process?
Yes.
Well, it's an ongoing process. So, well, first of all, we do kind of rapid reconstruction in Ukraine. So the roads, bridges are being rebuilt right now. Ukraine invests its own money. And also we have international support that I mentioned during my presentation. But the major reconstruction of the country will be obviously happening in the post-war time. And we will need, again, as was mentioned in my presentation, according to World Bank, at the moment, at least 411 billion US dollars. And that figure may rise. We have different assessments of direct and indirect damage. that could rise to $1 trillion and more. So the question will be where to raise these funds. Our position that Russian money have to be confiscated, not only frozen, and this should happen sooner rather than later. Then Ukrainian money, international money, and private capital. That's why we're talking today about blended finance, because every $2 or $3 of donor money will attract $7 to $8 of private capital. But today we're talking about SMEs specifically, so we'll be happy to answer questions of any SME sector, if any left.
Thank you, Sergio. And just we have 1 minute, and Natalie, I saw you raised your hand.
I'll just very quickly say that there is a segment of the World Bank report that is specific to 2023 and the recovery. It's about an estimate of $14.1 billion that is to be invested this year in the recovery. That has already started. Donors have already committed some 7 of that 14. Work has already begun and continues to happen on the ground in Ukraine. There is an agency for recovery that does some of the projects. Others are done from local, because Ukraine's system is so decentralized. So local municipalities and communities are proposing the projects. I think you're going to see more and more of this. And in terms of project availability, I believe in London, there's going to be an announcement of a project management system that will allow everyone to have visibility into what projects are out there. If I want to finance, say, schools, where are there school projects that are available for financing? And so I think all of this is happening as we speak in real time. And I don't think we need to wait for hostilities to cease, especially for the small and medium-sized business sector, who really are critical to making sure that this economy is sustainable going forward. If the Western allies are supporting Ukraine with approximately $3 billion a month for the budget deficit, that's the gap that needs to be filled with tax revenues over time. And the West isn't going to be able to do this for forever, infinitely. So building up that tax base again is critical, and that can be done most easily through supporting SME.
Can I just comment briefly? And I fully concur with what has been said. And I think it differs. I mean, Ukraine is different compared to many other countries that are in a war. That we are actually, I mean, if you look like a community like the DFIs, we are already active in looking at investments. I think so. I would say from any investor's perspective, it is. I mean, it's happening in parallel. Then I think it's important to look at that. There's so much differences between different sectors, and that's something that we really need to take into consideration. I think when we talk about that different capital is more suitable for different kind of sectors, because the risk levels are different at this point in time, and so is the geography, of course. But I think that's really important to keep that message going. And I think it was eloquently put when I was in Kyiv that Ukraine is open for business. And I think that, I mean, it is, and I think there is good proof if you look, for example, in the IT sector, showing that it's actually possible. There is competence, it's growing, there is talent and potential. And I think that's so important to keep that message going. It is now that we need to invest. And that's such an important part of the resilience, I think, of the economy that is so much needed, just like you said, Natalie. So I think that's really, really key, that we all try to figure out from our roles and mandates in this situation, what's possible, how can I contribute?
Thank you very much, Maria. And I can just say that if you have one DFI in a fund, you will usually have quite a few after that. They'll come together. So that's a very big perk working with DFIs in general. So thank you all very, very much. It's been very informative today. And yeah, it's just if you have any questions, I unfortunately haven't covered all of the questions, but we will be getting back to you with most detailed answers, and just please feel free to contact Ukrainian Invest or any of us if you have more questions. So thank you so much. I don't know, Sergio, if you want to make any closing remarks in addition to that, any announcements.
I just want to thank our speakers for, we had an excellent panel today, so such a useful insights. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the audience for being present. And this is not the end of the job. It's also not the beginning. It's we are in the process of building new Ukraine, of transforming Ukraine. So please, if you are an investor, do get in touch with us, and we will try to support you to the way we can. If you are a company looking for investment, also get in touch with us. We will be putting you in touch with investors. If you have any questions to Ukraine Invest about government of Ukraine, about doing business in Ukraine, please also do get in touch with us. We are always open to you 24/7. Thank you.